So at this point, you should be able to play through the game and have a fully functional game. Also go into your numbers, and as you're starting the game, you can adjust these to 20, set up as many as you want initially, and it should all work. As well as there's flexibility in the screen size and dynamic capability in making those adjustments as needed. So if you make it wider, then it's still going to work, and it's still going to work the same way. So that's really the objective, is to try to make it as dynamic and flexible as possible and reserve all of the gameplay so that you have the same functionality. It doesn't matter how wide your screen is going to be. So now let's go over and do a quick review of all of the code that we did and we went through in the earlier lessons in order to build this application. So there is some CSS, and the CSS was mainly to present the content in a better format. Also, we came into our project setting up our initial HTML. So we looked at what we need to present to the user in order to prepare them for the gameplay. So we have a score, we have the enemies left, we have a main container where we're going to outputting all of the gameplay, a message, a button to start the game, and a basket, which is the player's element. Then we used JavaScript to connect to all of those elements and have them as objects in JavaScript so we could utilize them in our code. We also set up some of the variables. We used getBoundingClientRectangle in order to get the dimensions of an element and use that and set that into variables that we could utilize within the code as well. We set up a few default objects, so the keys object, which handled all of the key presses, and then the player object, which handled all of the player values. Then we added in some event listeners, so mainly the start button, click, and then we have event listeners listening for key up and key down. The start button starts the game. So within the starting of the game, we still have to prepare the visuals. So we hide the start button, we hide the message, we show the player's basket, we reset some of the player object values, and then we update the score so it's visually updated, because every time we make an update to the score or to the total bad guys that are left, we have to update the score. So we're using a function called score update to create that, and what that does is that outputs the score value as well as the enemy left value and updates it on the page for the player. Then we set up bad guys, so this is dynamic as well. We can specify how many we want to set up and passing it into a function that loops through, and the make bad is the core function that's generating the bad guys, where we use JavaScript to create an element on the fly. We also once again update our score. We decrease the number of bad guys that are sitting there within the queue, and we also check to see if there are any still sitting in the queue if we're above 0, and if we're not above 0, then we know that the queue is empty. We don't have any to create anymore at this point. We create an element, a div, on the fly, adding in some inner text, inner HTML to it, and then we've got some randomness where we're randomizing its height values, so they're adjusting the height as well as the line height to the same value, creating a random background color, so generating a random hex value. We add in the class of baddie, so this is how we identify the elements that are the bad guy elements on the page, by adding the class of baddie, and then later on we're going to scan for all the elements with the class of baddie and then update their position. We set a random x value, and if x was less than 0, then we just set it to 100 because we don't want the value of x to be off the page. We also set a value for y, and then this is to show it off screen. Setting a random speed, so these are all numbers that can be adjusted and manipulated as needed. Then we append it to the container object and update its elements left and top position according to the div x and y values. So those are numeric values, and then for left and top, we need a string value with pics at the end, so a number with pics at the end. Play game was our core function, so this is our animation function that continuously loops while the player in play is equal to true, and once it's equal to false, then we're not going to be able to play the game anymore. We check to see what keys are pressed, and then also considering the boundaries, then we make an update to the bound basket y and bound basket x values, And those we use in order to adjust and output the style values of the basket element. And then we request the animation frame. We also loop through all of the elements with the class of baddie. And if there are none, then we end the game, because that means the game is over. There's nothing more to play. And if there are some, then we update their position. So while we're updating their position, we get their Y position and we add the speed to it. So that gives them all dynamic different speeds. We also check to see the position of Y. If it's gone off screen, then we reset it back to the top. So bring it back to the top, and we randomize where the X position is, and then we update the X position. And later we update the Y position. But first we check to see if a collision has taken place. If there is a collision, then we update the player's score. We remove the element from the container. We update the score visually for the player, and then we make another bad guy. And we also output the console hit, which is something that can be removed as well. We create collision detection. So this is where we're checking to see if the basket is collided with the element, and we check the values of the get bounding client rectangle object, and we've got the bottom and top positions, top and bottom positions. So we check the vertical first and then the horizontals, and if there is no overlap, so what we do is we negate that, so it turns back as a true value instead of a false value. So it makes more sense when we are checking to see if there's a collision. We could also negate it here at this point and remove the negating down here. So this is optional. You could do it either way. Then we also have the score update function, and we've got the key press handling. And what the key press handling does is all we do is set according to the key event. So we've got the keys object that has all the right key events listed in it, and as they get pressed, we just simply set them to true, and when they get released, they're set to false. And we use these values as we're iterating through the animation frame and checking to see what keys are currently being pressed, so that we can take the appropriate actions that moving the element on the screen. And that's it. So I hope you had an opportunity to try out some of the source code and try out some of the game functionality. Thanks again for taking this section on building out this game from scratch using JavaScript.